This conference will now be recorded.
Mr. Gilbert, it's yours. You're on mute.
And now I'm not. Okay, welcome. So we'll call the meeting to order and we'll start with a roll call vote.
Great. Trustee Gilbert?
Present.
Present. Lee Reeder?
Present.
Aptis?
Here.
Aptis present. Baines?
Here.
Baines present. Barandis?
Barandis here.
Barandis present. Burns?
Here.
Burns present. Jones?
Here.
Jones present. Thank you, Tom.
Okay, and this item 1.3, approval of the agenda. Does anybody have any changes or modifications they'd like to make?
None from staff.
I didn't hear what somebody said.
Staff has no changes to the agenda.
Okay, moving on. Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, joining the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Okay, item 1.5, Kevin.
Yeah, item 1.5, every year in December, we select a board president and vice president for the following 12 months. We do this in December because committee assignments based on the board president's recommendation will be confirmed in January. And so it gives the board president, whether new or returning board president, the opportunity to make those committee assignments for about a month, determine what committees he or she would like to see for the next year, and then present those to the board in January. So I would open up the floor for nominations for board president.
I'd like to nominate Tom Gilbert.
I'll second.
We have a motion and second for Tom Gilbert. Tom, do you accept the nomination?
I do.
So we can go ahead and take a roll call vote on, unless there's any other nominations. Hearing none, we'll take a roll call vote, Jolene, for the motion to have Tom Gilbert serve as board president.
Okay, great. Tom, would you like to vote?
Yes.
Thank you. Lee Reeder?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Aptis?
Aye.
Aptis, aye. Baines?
Aye.
Baines, aye. Barandis?
Barandis, aye.
Barandis, aye. Burns?
Aye.
Burns, aye. Jones?
Aye.
Jones, aye. Tom, you are the president.
Thank you. Thank you for your vote of confidence.
All right, and now I'll open the floor to, and congratulations, Tom. I'll open the floor to nominations for vice president.
I nominate Elena Reeder.
I'll second.
A motion by trustee Aptis, seconded by trustee Burns. Any other nominations? Hearing none. Elena, do you accept the nomination for vice president?
I do.
Affirmative. Jolene, will you take roll?
I will. Trustee Gilbert?
Yes.
Lee Reeder?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Aptis?
Aye.
Aptis, aye. Baines?
Aye.
Baines, aye. Barandis?
Barandis, aye.
Barandis, aye. Burns?
Aye.
Burns, aye. Jones?
Aye.
Jones, aye. Congratulations, Elena.
It was an emotional vote. Elena's getting choked up about it, it looks like.
I did too.
Congratulations, Elena. So over the next month, Tom, you'll need to talk to trustees about committee assignments, and then let me know ahead of the January board meeting so I can include your recommendation in the packet to be confirmed, okay?
Okay.
Thank you. Item 1.6 is designation of board secretary. Every year, we designate the board secretary. Staff recommends that the current board secretary continue in that role, and that's Jolene. And so if there's basically the option for the board of trustees is to designate essentially Jolene or the general manager as board secretary. And Jolene does a fantastic role as board secretary, and I talked to her earlier this week and she's willing to continue to do that. Thank you, Jolene. So unless there's a preference to move away from that from the board, I would go ahead and accept a motion and a second for Jolene as board secretary.
I'll
I'll
move.
move.
Oh, sorry.
This is Gilbert. I'll move for Jolene as the secretary.
I'll
Second.
Motion and second by trustee Burns.
Thank you. Ready for roll call?
Yes, please.
Okay, trustee Gilbert,
Yes.
aye. Lee Reader,
Aye.
Lee Reader, aye. Abdus,
Aye.
Abdus, aye. Baines,
Aye.
Baines, aye. Barandis,
Brandis, aye.
Barandis, aye. Burns,
Aye.
Burns, aye. Jones,
Aye.
Jones, aye. Thank you. I am,
Congratulations, Jolene. Thank you for the procedural stuff here at the start of the meeting. Item 1.7 is conflict of interest. So if there's any items on the agenda that any trustees potentially have that could be of conflict, please identify those items now, and we'll recuse you from that discussion and vote on a particular item. Hearing none, we'll move on. There are no scheduled presentations other than what we have from consultants during the scheduled items portion of the agenda today. I'll open up public comment for any items not on the agenda. I don't believe we have anyone from the public attending, but if there's any public comment on items not on the agenda, you may do so now. Hearing none, we'll go on to informational items. Item 4.1, General Manager's Report. I do have two updates to the General Manager's Report. I did receive a draft lease agreement from the City of Sacramento for the Rosin Court property. I've sent the draft agreement that the city drew up over to Scott and Rebecca for review and comment on. And per the board's direction, it was to negotiate those deal points that the board approved back in, gosh, I think it was October or so, and then work with the city to come with a draft potential lease agreement to return to the board for further discussion. So kind of at the intermediate step now, we finally received something back from the city. And so we're working on comments on that, and we'll send back to the city. And when we get close to a potential final draft, we'll bring it to the board and present that probably in two steps, right? We want to hear comments back on the draft from the full board and then come back with a final potential approval at a subsequent meeting. So that's coming up. The Rosin Court site right now is still occupied by the Corps, probably will be until April or so. And so the thought from the city would be that we enter into a lease agreement in the interim period, if this is their desire, enter into a lease agreement for the property that would become effective once the date written on the effective date would be written in such that once Safeca and the Corps return the property to its prior condition and they vacated the site. So at least that was in their draft agreement that they sent over. So look for that, depending on Scott and Rebecca's review and how long it takes the city to respond to our comments back. We potentially could have this to the board in draft form in January, most likely February, given the holiday and other work demands from the city. So it's coming probably first quarter of next year. The second item I want to make the board aware of, not in the general manager's report, as it's new information. We do have a pretty significant storm that's brewing out in the Pacific. We'll get a little taste of that storm starting on Sunday. However, the models are suggesting that it could pick up in intensity. They're not sure yet on the timing of it, but potentially by Wednesday or Thursday, we could see significant precipitation and wind coming next week, Wednesday and Thursday. accumulation for the total event from Wednesday or from Sunday through Thursday potentially is looking about like 3 inches. So as long as it's spread out in a couple days and not as intense as that 24-hour period in October that we had, given our pump situation and our facility status, we look like we're ready to handle this storm that's coming in. The wind is a little bit of a concern because we did have some issues, last year with a high wind event that knocked out some power poles from SMUD. And then Plant 8, after the October event, we had some significant pump failures at Pumping Plant 8, all electrically related. We have replaced a control module on our largest pump at Plant 8. It was about a $2,500 repair, but that pump is operational, so we feel very good about having our 2 largest pumps available to us. However, there are some other significant wiring repairs and such for other pumps at Plant 8 that if it's raining, we have the electrician, they troubleshot it last week or earlier this week. If it's raining on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday, probably won't be able to get that wiring redone and those other pumps online. So we're sitting at about 45% capacity at Pumping Plant 8 right now going into this storm, which is not ideal, but we believe it's enough for this storm, provided the performance and the pumps that actually failed at Pumping Plant 8 during the October event, and we still got through. So a little bit of background on what's going on at Pumping Plant 8. And it's just an indication about the age and the condition of the electrical system at Pumping Plant 8 and kind of the urgency of which to do that entire electrical upgrade. So we are under contract with KSN for the design on that, and hopefully have the design come in soon. And then as soon as we get funding in place, we can start doing those major upgrades. Some of the wiring that's required, the cost estimate for the repairs is over $100,000 just to do the wiring between the pump and the electrical panel. So I wanted to update the board going into the storm coming up next week, and everything else we're ready for with the facilities that we have available to us. Good news is Pumping Plant 3, the transformer from SMUD has been installed and operational, and we're waiting on the rest of the facility repairs to be done before that plant comes online. But that was Pumping Plant 4. So that's in place, and that was kind of what was delaying Plant 4 from coming back online. Pumping Plant 3 still has some significant work on the discharge pipes to get that up and running, and probably will be unavailable to us throughout the remainder of the flood season. Any questions on the general manager's report or the additional information I shared?
I have some questions, Kevin. What's the status of Pumping Plant 1, A and B? What's obviously they're pretty critical.
Yeah, 1B is operational. We feel we have full capacity at Pumping Plant 1B. The issue with 1B during that first event in October was debris loading on the trash racks or the debris racks. We did have some lower chain guides that did fail and bind up. And so the fix for those lower chain guides, obviously when we're pumping, we can't put divers in to do any replacement underwater. It's just a dangerous condition for any personnel to be underwater during a pump event. And so what we do is we cut the chain off from above the water, and essentially that chain and that portion of the debris rack is no longer functional until pretty much after the flood season. So we, actually Gabe has talked to the manufacturer about creating a different design for the lower chain guides to kind of put a Teflon bushing down there as opposed to the metal guide that is there now. And what happens is the chain and the guide kind of rust and corrode and cause a lot of friction down there, and it binds up. Having that Teflon bushing or a rubber bushing down there will help guide that through a little easier, less friction there, and hopefully, it's kind of like brake pads on a car. Right now we have kind of just rotors that we're relying on, and you put a brake pad in between, and that's kind of the wear point, and doesn't cause some catastrophic failure. And then you replace those brake pads, on a routine basis. We would look to do the same thing with these lower Teflon guides, replace them, and we will have to see the performance of them, but potentially annually, but they're not as expensive as replacing the entire lower guide. So our issue with pumping plant 1B was literally the debris racks that got so loaded up with debris that it caused the pump to turn off because you couldn't get water through all the trash and debris that had loaded up on the racks. So we go out there and then find out the chain guides were bound up, so we had to cut those off. We do have functionality. I think there was a total of 6 out of 48 chains that we had to cut off at that last storm event. And these are items that should be replaced every 5 to 10 years, chains and guides, and that's built into our CIP plan. The electrical condition of pumping plant 1B is pretty good. The only thing we'd worry about there is a power failure, and then we'd have about 24 hours with the backup diesel generator. So 1B is in good shape for this coming storm, and essentially that's our last line of defense. Pumping plant 1A is essentially unavailable to us. And in the CIP, it calls for essentially complete replacement of the pumping system, motors, and electrical system in pumping plant 1A. And that's something that we would need to do moving forward with funding. So we think we're okay for this storm. And then to Nick, further on, I do have a meeting set up, or 2 potential dates set up from Rick Johnson to meet with the Corps' construction project management group in January, I think either the 11th or 12th, and this goes on to the conversation I had with Rick about future contracts on Reach A and the potential going into the season without pumping plants available to us, that we would no longer accept that. So to further that, Rebecca and I and Paul Devereaux have been working with Safeco on the relocation agreement for pumping plant 1A and 1B and putting in some strong language to the contractor and the Corps for liability wise and some assurances that are different than the assurances we've had in the past about timing and sequencing of construction projects, so that we don't repeat this mistake of pumping plant 3 while we do Reach A and pumping plant 1A and 1B. And one of those items in particular is making sure you have all the materials on site before you do any decommissioning of the existing pumping capacity. So those are things that we're looking at doing, so there's no supply chain issues or pointing around that they couldn't get parts or materials, that everything's ordered and available on site before any of our capacity is reduced at pumping plant 1B.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I'm going to take this opportunity again to just underscore, my great concern, that we have only one pumping plant, on the west side of the basin, and that's pumping plant 1B. And, all our eggs are in that basket. And, this storm, maybe not, but we got a whole winter ahead of us. And so I continue to be very concerned. So hopefully, there are some potential redundancy, resiliency efforts that, can be supported by the Corps. Hopefully when you talk to Safeco, certainly I'd like to hear back on the progress of those discussions. But, this is very concerning, everyone, and we should be, hyper focused on this issue and make sure that we don't get put in this position again. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree, Nick. And, despite the assurances we had that pumping plant 3 would be available to us before the flood season started, but it just didn't happen. And there's no fallback to it. So we're very fortunate that the October event, that Gabe and his crew acted quickly and appropriately to get the plants back online, because it was pretty close. And like I said last month, that was a historic event. It was a 200-year or greater storm event, and those come around ever so often, but who knows when the next one's going to come. That's the thing. So we have to make sure that we're ready.
Right. And another thing I want to say is that, there is a lot of deferred maintenance on our facilities as well, that certainly our CIP, is, focused on, but it's not funded. And so, that continues to be something that also should be front and center, which we're talking later about in the agenda. But here's another example where, we need to do additional investment in our infrastructure. So, all right, thanks.
You're welcome. Any other questions on the general manager's report?
Yeah, Kevin, this is Chris. To Nick's point, I'm just curious, do we have a contingency plan in place if pumping plant 1 I mean, we get strongly worded language, but that's all it is. If it doesn't matter if the pumping plant doesn't come back on. So are we planning for a contingency to Nick's point that like, you know, that if plant 1 doesn't get back online during the construction, that we know what we're going to do if that doesn't happen? Do we have that in place?
Yeah, so what we're working on, great question, Chris, and Rebecca, feel free to chime in here too. Part of the relocation agreement that we have to enter into with the Corps for pumping plant, you know, essentially it's relocation of the discharge pipes that and access to the, you know, the facilities that lead to the pumping plant. The pump buildings are staying the same, but in that agreement, what we want to put in is requiring a bypass system sufficient in capacity to match the capacity that's taken offline at any certain point. We've written in ahead of time that all capacity must be restored prior to the flood season. That's similar language to the pumping plant 3. There's no teeth in that. I don't know what I mean, you can put contractor damages and daily damages, but that would pale in comparison to the damage that we would have with flooding in the Thomas with the unavailability of those plants. And so some of the things that we're looking at is making sure they have all the material on site when they go to, say, pull out the discharge pipes for pumping plant 1B, is that they have the replacement pipes like on site, whether it's at our corporation yard or right there at Boat Works or across at the DART facility. We're trying to put as strong a language as we can in there as possible, and that we have emergency access to the site at all times to do whatever means necessary. Also to have backup generation if they take any of our electrical equipment offline during the pump replacements or discharge pipe replacements, that they have full capacity at the start of the flood season. And so the other item that we're looking at having them do is sequencing the decommissioning of you know, phasing it and doing it in sequential years. This is a multi-year project, so we want them to, you know, only reduce our pumping capacity when they take it offline during the non-flood season by no more than 50% of the time. We still have rice water that we'll have to deal with during next summer during their construction, and so it's a challenging project for sure, but we're trying to put those contingencies in place the best that we can think of, and we've had everyone that we know of kind of chime in on our behalf, you know, from Mead and Hunt to, you know, thoughts from Safeco to our own internal staff, KSN and Rick Reinhardt as well from MBK. So we got the best people on it coming up, and obviously Scott and Rebecca are the best in the business on the legal side. So, you know, we're trying to put everything in. It's just a matter of whether the Corps approves that or not. And it's, you know, because it is different than other relocation agreements that the Corps signed in the past, but we definitely want to include all of our demands in a memo and in a relocation agreement that we send over to them and let them respond.
Okay, so I just want to make sure. So we are planning, we do have backup plans like to run plant 6 if we need to, if, even though it hasn't been run for 20 years, we do have plans to run other plants. Irrespective of the legalese and the wording that's in there, we do have backup, actual physical backups ready.
Yeah, we do. The only downfall there is that despite our best efforts, the upper system capacity, there would still be water that makes its way down to pumping plant 1A and 1B. It's kind of the catch-all. So yes, we, in fact, Gabe, earlier this week went out to pumping plant 6 that hasn't been run in 30 plus years. We have a dive team coming in and doing some dredging in front of that sump to get that operational, even for potentially this year to use, and that'll help. I know there's some community complaint about running pumping plant 6, and we got to be careful about backwater conditions up into Pleasance Grove, but you know, backwater into an agricultural field is, in my opinion, far better than backup into a residential property. And so we'll deal with the community complaints in Pleasance Grove if that should occur. But we are attempting to get 6 online as we speak, and leading into next year, we'll do whatever electrical repairs we need to do to get us through for pumping plant 8 as soon as we can this year, and prep it, you know, for next year as well. again, it's very old equipment, and who knows when the next electrical component's going to fail. But yeah, we're looking at everything we can do internally as well. We've talked to Natomas Mutual in addition to that to have them kind of give us some more timing by operating their recirculation pumps and putting water back into their agricultural or irrigation delivery system, so you kind of recirculate it around so it doesn't hit the drains, and that keeps some other pressure off us, at least gives us some time that we don't get hit by a wall of water coming down. So yeah, we're putting contingency plans in place for sure.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the GM report? All right, hearing none, we'll go on to the operations manager's report. Gabe? Gabe, you're on mute. Did you want to?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so just like Kevin was saying, we've been spending a lot of time at Omb Compliant Rate, diagnosing the wiring. It's quite cumbersome on the wiring. Coming from the pump motors to the actual switchgear inside the building, they go through about 4 to 5 volts. So it's quite a long run to diagnose each and every wire. And they're in a bundle, the conduit's old, so we've been spending a lot of time doing that. And as Kevin mentioned, pumping plant 6, it has been dredged. We're going to get out there next week to do a initial fire up on the motors. We're going to have an electrician on site just in case something does go wrong, but we're hopeful to have 6 up and running by the end of next week. So that's a good deal. Pumping plant number 4 is offline, so that water essentially can be pumped out. A portion of it can be pumped out at number 6. Number 3, like Kevin said, it's moving along well. With this rain coming, it's probably going to slow it down a little bit, but it's expected to be online in emergency capacity the 1st of the year. And the final date now to be fully functional is probably the end of January. So we'll see how that goes. It changes weekly depending on the responses from the Corps and the weather. So other than that, we're just performing maintenance at the facilities. We did order some chains and guides for pumping plant 1B, which is good. So those should be here in about 2 months. We will attempt to change those chains and guides depending on the weather and the rain. If we don't see a whole lot of rain coming in, and we know we can shut that plant down, then we'll have a dive team come out and change the guides and chains. So other than that, just kind of knocking things off as we can.
I did want to add one thing to Gabe's report. Starting next week, we are going to start doing a weekly debris cleanup along the Natomas East Main Drain. So any debris and material that's been left on the bike path or the levee embankment that's unattended, essentially we're considering an illegal dumping. And so we'll begin on a routine basis going out, making sure obviously that no one is occupying underneath any of the debris that's left there. But essentially, we're going to start removing the trash and stuff that's been accumulating. East Levee Road opened up about 3 weeks ago, and it just seems to be a dumping ground like we see in other parts of the rural parts of the county, where we just get dumping, over the weekends and stuff. And so if no one's there claiming personal property, we are assuming it's debris that's been left, and we're going to haul it away.
One thing I forgot to mention, we have Blankenship and Nutrient working together along with our staff to create a little test plot that we're trying to prevent the native grass from growing so fast. Essentially, we're mowing the outer perimeter of the district, 3 to 4 times a year. We're going to do a test plot. We have a cocktail of chemicals that we're going to lay down on this over on the Natomas Cross Canal. It's about a 100-foot stretch. So if we can get the native grass to become somewhat dormant, then it'll essentially it'll prevent us from having to mow the levee 3 to 4 times and essentially mow it one time. So it could be a huge savings, it could free up a ton of time. So we'll see what happens with that. We're going to give it about a month to do its work. So Should be interesting to see what comes of it.
Yeah, so the intent there is that the native grass grows to a certain height to help prevent erosion from the soil surface on the levee, but not too high that we have to go in and mow it 3 or 4 times a year. So you essentially stun it at a certain growth stage. And so, yeah, Gabe, thank you for mentioning that, working with Blankenship and our chemical supplier to come out and do a test plot. And I think that'll, you know, if we get the right mixture for the native grass that we have and the right timing of that application, we can significantly reduce our time mowing and be able to do other maintenance functions other than 3 or 4 times around the district in the mowers. So yeah, thanks Gabe for heading that up and coming up with that creative solution.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in on that. So I wanted to say thanks on the trash pickup. Obviously, it's a continuing problem all along Steelhead Creek, even after the last storms, as campers moved out of down in this drainage way. They left their belongings behind and just became trash. And it is god awful down there. And to the degree there's any cooperative effort with any other agencies, including the water board, you know, I'm happy to facilitate those discussions. But you know, all that trash ends up in the river and then ends up in the delta and in the ocean. I mean, there's no doubt about that. So appreciate doing our part on that. And then in terms of the maintenance activities, certainly want to extend a thank you to Gabe and Kevin for kind of thinking outside the box in terms of, you know, cost savings to maintenance activities. You know, we're trying to figure out creative ways as these, you know, obligations to maintain these newly improved levees increase because of increase in land area. It's, I think it's good. So continue thinking that way. I think, you know, any efforts we can use to minimize and maximize efficiencies and minimize expenses as it relates to O&M, you know, that's a big deal. So
yeah,
kudos.
Appreciate that. And then just one word of caution on the debris pickup. You know, there is a little bit of risk involved in that, and that, you know, we may get claim, you know, some claim or complaint that we are harassing or removing personal property. We'll handle that if that comes up, but it's trash. If you drive out there, there's just large piles of trash, like huge rolls of concrete or carpet that's just rolled up, laid out, shopping carts everywhere. You know, it's literally trash. So I am thinking of a policy on this issue that I would like to draft up and talk further with the board about, wherein maybe, you know, we allow some sort of camping and resting for a period of time, but that needs to be further developed. And a lot of discussions, there is risk and liability in doing that, but there's also risk and liability for the damage that's being done out there. So we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place on this, and we'll have to make some tough decisions moving forward if we want to effectuate any change. We've tried the legislative route. It's been unsuccessful for 2 years. We do have a city ordinance in place, but they're not enforcing it due to COVID. And so we're going to have to, if we want to really address this issue, come up with some creative solutions and accept some risk and liability on one side or the other, because it's just spiraling out of control. We have more developments coming on in the next few years, which will bring even more of this element to a further portion of our levy system. And so look for that in the coming months, a policy specifically on this. Go ahead, Deborah, I see your hand up.
Kevin, you mentioned concrete. Are we talking large pieces of concrete? Because
Yeah,
that's concerning.
I meant to say carpet. I meant to say carpet, not concrete. We do get dumping of concrete and like building materials out in the rural areas on the levees. It's like someone's doing a home improvement project. They put a load of trash in their trailer and they dump it out there instead of taking it to the dump. Yeah, I meant to say carpet. So one picture I saw the other day was like 3 large rolls of, you know, flooring, carpet flooring, you know, just sitting out there, you know, piled up on bags of trash and, you know, shopping carts and stuff like that. And
understood, but that's still concerning. That's a bit more than just a single homeless person or a couple of homeless people dumping their personal stuff. If we have folks out there doing stuff like that, is there, you know, and pose this question to council as well. Is there any way we can impose any fees for dumping? Because that's dumping.
Yeah, and so that's what we want to address, and we're going to start this weekly cleanup. We'll see how that goes. The problem is, even with the rural dumping that we have from these, home improvement projects that don't end up at the actual landfill, it's hard to track them and find out who, did it. The police department and law enforcement doesn't have the resources to do investigations on that. We've tried. So the fee, and then who are you going to extract the fee from? It's hard to even have a warrant sweep out there. It's a really difficult situation, but what I am thinking about and what I want to come back to the board with is kind of a permitted allowance for a certain period of time for a certain size of an encampment. We'd have to hire some security or someone to kind of monitor that and deal with that on a day in, day out basis. But essentially, move them on after what's afforded to them as a basic human right of resting. And so resting, in my opinion, and we'd obviously weigh in with legal and others, but, is 24 hours enough for resting? And if that's the case, fine, 24 hours it is. But after that, you need to move on off of this critical public safety infrastructure so that we can monitor and maintain the levee for the benefit of the entire community, including these individuals. So
understood, Kevin, but what I'm getting at is there appears that there's two different types of debris that we're dealing with. And, all that you said is true. It's difficult to enforce. But, even just some sort of passive thing like additional signage that says, this is the property of RD 1000 and this, illegal dumping. If some sort of passive stuff, because, signage can be a deterrent for those individuals that are dumping large items like carpet and home improvement stuff. I see the debris associated with the homeless as something different because I doubt that they're dumping large rolls of carpet.
They are. They're bringing it to the levee. They're bringing furniture, couches. You'd be amazed at the resources they have to bring stuff to the levee. The other day I saw a four-wheeler down there, a large fire pit, barbecues, anything you can imagine. They steal the construction fencing from temporary construction fencing and they're making forts out of it. So the carpet was specifically at what appears to be a homeless encampment up on the levee system. So no way for that wasn't a home improvement project. So yes, I understand there are two differences here, but I just wanted to update the board and we can move on from this topic, but we are going to start picking up that debris and trash if it's unoccupied. And I want the board to understand that we may get some complaint from that population moving forward, but it's time for us to act. If we don't, it's just going to get worse and we're not going to have any access to our levee. Gabe and I were on a tour with Allen Strategic earlier this week, and we found an encampment that had dug the stairs in again to the levee, dug in a backstop for their tent. So we're on that right away. We've noticed that to PD to have them removed, and then so we can get in there and do the repair. And it's just, we have to start acting. Yeah.
Please keep track of any additional costs incurred by us for collecting all this trash. This isn't the line of work we're in.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we're forced to be in it to make sure that we can inspect the levees, right? But yeah, we will track those costs and appreciate that. So if there's no other questions on the operations manager's report, we can move on to item 4.3, district council report.
Good morning. Good to see you all. So as Kevin indicated, we're working with Safeco and the Corps on your Plant 1 agreement and received draft deal points from the city on Rosin Court. That's really kind of comprised most of our activity for this month. as you continue to work on encampments and consider an encampment policy, we're happy to work with Kevin on that. I will tell you that actually both Scott and I have been heavily involved in that kind of activity for other districts, and so are happy to impart any lessons learned and help you to get something that works for your operations. So.
Thank you, Rebecca. Moving on to consent calendar, I would entertain a motion to approve consent calendar items 1 through 5.
So moved.
I do have one change on the resolution for, I believe it's 5.5 for our, if I can pull it up here, one second. The resolution does indicate October 8th here. It needs to read October, I believe it was October 12th was our last meeting where we approved the reauthorization. So I will change that to the November date of our trustees meeting and make that into the resolution if you accept that change.
Yeah, I'll accept that change. So I'll amend my motion to include those changes.
All right. Motion by Trustee Avis, second by Lee Reeder, with the change to Resolution 2021-1201. There's a motion to approve consent calendar items 1 through 5, 5.1 through 5.5. Jillian, will you take roll?
Yes, Trustee Gilbert.
Aye.
Gilbert, aye. Lee Reeder.
Aye.
Lee Reeder, aye. Abdus.
Aye.
Abdus, aye. Baines.
Aye.
Baines, aye. Barandis.
Brandis, aye.
Barandis, aye. Burns.
Aye.
Burns, aye. Jones.
Aye.
Jones, aye. Motion is approved.
Thank you, Jillian. We'll move on to item 6.1, the audited financial statements. We have Ingrid here from Richardson and Company, who's our auditor under contract, and Rob Merritt as well from Chavez Accountancy. And so Rob's our district accountant. I will turn it over to Ingrid. Ingrid, I'll pull up your outline for the audit, and then I will let you go through. I'll also pull up the audit, and you can guide me through any pages you want me to navigate to you.
Okay. I'm just going to do a really high overview because we did meet with the audit committee to go over the results page by page. So I'm just going to touch on the highlights of the results of the audit. The most important part of the audit is the independent auditor's report, and that is considered an unmodified or clean opinion on the financial statements. As far as some of the highlights of the numbers in the financial statements, the statement of net position, which is a full accrual basis, meaning it includes all of the assets and liabilities of the district, shows a positive net position of 10.5 million. So that indicates that you have reserves going forward for future expenditures. The statement of activities shows that the revenues exceeded expenses by 2.1 million. That does include depreciation expense on your infrastructure and other assets of 1.5 million. It does include some somewhat one-time revenue sources. There was about 1 million of FMAP grant proceeds recorded. There was also 1.3 million of development fees from the Greenbrier development included in there, as well as some developer-funded improvements of the district system of about 934,000. So that's all included in that net income of 2.1 million. The general fund balance sheet shows assigned fund balance of 11 million. And that is based on the reserve policy that the board has established. One of the footnotes in the financial statements shows the various assigned fund balances that you have. There's 1.5 million that's in the flood fight reserve, about 4.8 million in the capital fund reserve, and then the O&M fund is funded at 70% of the O&M budget. So you're on track with the reserves established by your policy. We also talked at the committee meeting about the pension liability and Opeb liability. The pension liability is 1.3 million. That is based on an actuarial valuation performed by CalPERS. And then the Opeb liability is at 188,000, pretty minimal balance there, and it is based on an actuarial valuation as well. The budget to actual comparison is showing revenue is higher than what you had budgeted by about 371,000. Expenses were about 2.9 below budget, and that's because of some of your capital projects that were delayed. The report on internal control and compliance is also a clean report, and this indicates that we noted no weaknesses in internal controls and that the district complied with various laws and contracts material to the financial statements. We also issued a governance letter, and some of the items that is contained within that letter, it discusses audit adjustments or changes that we made to the district's accounting records. We only had 2 adjustments that were identified in the audit process. So overall, the books are very clean. This letter also indicates that we had no difficulties in performing the audit. If we did, we would need to bring those to your attention, and also that there's no unusual accounting practices. And we also issued a management letter that contains other areas for improvement that were not considered material weaknesses, but just other items for consideration to improve controls and processes. This includes some recommendations on reconciliations for pension and Opeb accounts, also some review of payroll register and timesheets. We also had 2 new comments this year about purchase orders and just making sure that those are complete and approved prior to the purchases being made. And then also we had a recommendation about formalizing the purchasing policy. So overall, good, clean audit, just a few areas for recommendations for improvement. So I'd like to open it up to any questions you may have.
Yeah, Ingrid, thank you for that. I do want to point out that the Finance Committee, as reported in item 7.1.1, did make a recommendation to the board to receive and file a unanimous recommendation from the Finance Committee after reviewing this in obviously more detail than the outline today, to receive the audit and have Richardson and Company file that by the deadline in January.
Can I ask, Tom, is there anything you want to draw our attention to? Any general comment on this? I certainly look to you for sort of some insight here as a non-accounting professional on this end of the phone, at least. This is a lot of gobbledygook here. It seems like, obviously nothing's bubbled up that's an issue, but I always like to gut check. Is there anything that we need to keep an eye on, or anything that grabs our attention that bears highlighting from your perspective?
Mr. Gilbert, you're muted.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Kevin. I think the key is the last couple of pages, which are just what we refer to as management improvement recommendations. And I think maybe a couple of those are worthy of comment right now. But the clean audit, all of those things, again, a governmental audit is a lot more intensive than a regular financial audit because of all the compliance requirements. I wanted to point out that one of the reasons we have Richardson and Company is we did go out to rotate auditors several years ago. Richardson has a good reputation with the state controller's office, and so we felt that they were a good match for our organization. And Kevin, I don't know if you have any comments about there were 4 findings, I guess, of management improvement recommendations. I think we've addressed all of them. Go ahead.
I think we have, because these were kind of known. I mean, keep in mind, these are financials through the end of June of 2021. So we have made some changes based on these findings as far as payroll approval goes. We did have a missing timesheet that we've now had that employee added to our Replicon system. And so prior to that, there was a time card that came through or that was missing. But now in Replicon, all those approvals are done. I do want to point out one of the notes that we discussed with the Finance Committee was about the pension liability and PERS discount rate. There is a potential for essentially a 1% increase in that discount rate, which would have some significant bearing on our contributions to the pension with that 1% change. And so that won't impact our budget. If PERS does enact the change in the discount rate, we won't see it for 2 years or so based on the actuarials that come. They're kind of 2 years delayed before we actually see the change in rates. But we're going to keep an eye on that and look at our actuarials and then make decisions during our budgeting process to address the change in the discount rate for PERS. So that's the only thing I would point out, Tom. But other than that, a clean, unmodified opinion is the highest standard that we can achieve. And I want to thank Jolene and Christina and Rob for doing a fantastic job with our records over the last year and earning this unmodified opinion. And keep moving forward with changes. We will be looking at addressing the purchasing policy with the board policy updates. So we'll see that and hopefully done before the next audit period. And so we can check that off our list. But anyway, good job, Jolene, Christina, and Rob. And thank you, Ingrid, for all your time putting this together. So any other questions on the audit?
I just want to add that we believe that we had a very thorough audit. Speaks well to our auditors and to our staff. And I want to thank, we just echo Kevin's comments about the staff and the end product.
So I would entertain a motion at this time, if there's no questions or no public comment, a motion to receive and file the audit financial statements as presented, and further direct Ingrid to file those with the state by January.
So moved.
Okay.
I have a motion by Trustee Jones, a second by Baines. Yeah, Jag, you got in on that one?
I think somebody else did, but I'll take it.
I think it was Miranda's, but
right there every time. But we'll take Jag's second this time. And so, Jolene, will you take roll?
I will. Trustee Gilbert.
Aye.
Aye. Lee Reader.
Aye.
Aye. Aptis.
aye.
Aptis. Aye. Baines.
Aye.
Baines. Aye. Barandis.
Brandis, aye.
Brandis. Aye. Burns.
Burns, aye.
Burns. Aye. Jones.
Aye.
Jones. Aye. Approved.
Motion's approved. Thank you, Jolene. And thank you, Ingrid, for all your work this year. Appreciate it. Look forward to working with you again next year as we're still under contract. And Rob, thank you so much. Rob, feel free to stick around for the next agenda item if you'd like. Ingrid, you're free to enjoy the rest of your weekend.
All right, thank you very much.
All right.
Bye.
All right, Greg, are you with us?
I am.
There he is. There's Greg. So Greg's with MBS, and item 6.2 is the Comprehensive Financial Plan Phase 2.1. So when the board approved this earlier this year for Phase 2, we approved the entire contract with MBS for the two components of Phase 2, that being the look and the determination between potential funding sources and mechanisms. And that's what we're going to present today as item phase 2.1, which really dives into the difference between fee and assessment for potential funding of the district's revenue shortfall as we project into the future. So Greg's prepared this report. Phase 2.2, so what we'll be asking the board to do today is, our recommendation is to approve phase 2.1, and you'll see the recommendation as we move through here on a fee potential revenue source, and further investigate that in phase 2.2. So the board authorized the complete phase 2 as far as contracting goes, but asked me to pause as soon as we were done with 2.1, return to the board for this understanding, and then proceed, if approved today, with phase 2.2, which will provide us more detail on the specifics of the fee, how it impacts essentially every parcel or customer within our basin, and then timing to move forward in the details that would be necessary for us to go out and continue our education campaign on this item, with potential return to the board to approve a fee in November of 2022, and then start the public process. So that's our timeline, and this is all in the effort to be able to enact a fee to increase revenue for the district based on our CIP and other projections in our phase 1 of the comprehensive financial plan, so that we can be on the county's assessment roll and fee roll for June-July timeframe of 2023. So with that, I'll turn it over to Greg, and we'll walk through at a high level the difference between fee and assessment, and I'll pull that up now. So go ahead, Greg.
Thank you. Yeah, and I want to respect the board's time, and feel free to adjust my altitude as I'm presenting the material. We will stay high level. I'm planning on doing just a quick page by page through this report, only hitting selected items that I think are material. However, if any members of the board have a question on a specific page or item, we are here and prepared to answer those questions.
Yeah, Greg, I do want to point out for the full board, the recommendation from the Finance Committee was to approve phase 2.1 and move on to phase 2.2. So we'll go ahead and walk through this kind of page by page. You know, the purpose of the report, maybe we'll start, Greg, at, you know, I think the board has the background on how we got to this point. They've all been here, but the funding instrument overview is probably a good place to start.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. And I do want to thank the Finance Committee for their comments that were provided in our previous meeting. Those comments are incorporated into this version of the report. And what we're looking at here primarily is, as we heard earlier about the district's capital needs, we are looking at expanding the revenue for the district and also replacing the existing assessment. So in that context, we evaluated the 3 primary families of funding instruments, which are taxes, assessments, and fees. Your current funding mechanism is an assessment, pre-Prop 218, and it's levied based upon special benefits. And one of those special benefits enumerated in the current assessment is flood protection, and that benefit is assigned to properties based on an estimated value of the properties so protected. We're looking at enacting a property-related fee, which is the last item there, and you can see the final column, the required findings, is as opposed to benefits, it's levied according to the proportional cost of providing the service to each parcel. And so there's a different methodology or a different method of allocating costs to property. So therefore, it's going to look different than your existing instrument. And I just wanted to highlight that. There's a number of advantages to using the property-related fee. The approval threshold is lower. It's a majority approval, as opposed to, you can see in the line for the taxes on the approval threshold, 2/3, versus the assessment, which is also a majority protest, but there's a complication there relative to the determinations of special benefit, which I think are going to be quite problematic for the district, which is one reason why the special assessment fell off the table fairly quickly. So as it relates to the property-related fee, it really is the primary vehicle currently being used in the state to fund these types of services. And it's what we're proposing and recommending, and what I think the district is accepting as our recommendation. Further through the report, we go through some detailed modeling, preliminary, albeit, of the property-related fee. So Kevin, if we can keep rolling, unless there's any questions at this point. Hearing none. I want to touch on page 4, which is the current funding, which I think highlights where we are today. And, you know, as has been discussed, the district certainly has a CIP need, and it needs additional revenue to meet that need. Next page, Kevin. The CIP as programmed is affectionately termed as lumpy. You can see it's got a lot of peaks and valleys in it. Next page. What we did to flatten the revenue requirements, and as Kevin has indicated, they will work with a flattened revenue source and modify the CIPs such that they articulate with one another. So next page. When we marry all that together, this is what your revenue requirement looks like. The black line is our proposed revenue generated via enaction of this proposed property-related fee. You'll see the divergence between the black line and the red line. The reason the red line is dropping off is your current revenue, and included in that number is the existing assessment. So upon completion and approval of the new property-related fee, the district would discontinue the existing special assessment. Therefore, the existing revenues would drop off. So don't be alarmed by the red line there. Next page, please, Kevin.
Yeah, 1 second here, guys. There we go. I do want to point out, sorry, the GoToMeeting box covers up some of the functionality. I do want to point out one line that could be added to this table, just thinking about this, is that if the do nothing alternative, you would essentially see the black line here continue with a modest, very slightly increase, but around the $6 million mark moving forward, or just under, into perpetuity. And you can see from this chart, like 2027, 2028 fiscal year, that revenue stream pretty much marries the O&M expenditures only, as those continue to increase based on the model projections from phase 1. And so the do nothing approach, and I think, Greg, that we'll include that in the final report for phase 2.1 and 2.2, but include a line there. Go ahead.
It's on page 4, Kevin.
On page 4, okay.
Yeah, it's the existing.
Yep. So on page 4, you can see that existing red line just kind of hovers there, but by 2028, we're getting very close to matching revenue with expenditures and not including any CIP. So thank you, Greg, and we'll move on from that chart, but I wanted to make that note. Back to you.
Right, and to that point, you know, the sooner we can take action, the better, obviously. And I really appreciate the district's approach in giving the district time to communicate with the public and make sure that we have a successful approval. Okay, so as we've looked at the financial results on page 7, we're going to move to page 8 and go up a bit. So just to unpack a moment what it means relative to the property-related fee, charging according to the proportional cost of the service. So step 1 is defining what is the service that we're providing, and the district's mission statement is a beautiful summation of the services provided, and it essentially declares that you're doing 2 things. You're maintaining a levee around the exterior of the district, which prevents exterior floodwaters from entering in and creating a flood situation. And number 2, you are managing the internal stormwaters that are generated by water falling, hitting the ground, and then having to be managed by your internal stormwater system. And so that is how we broke the cost allocation out according to those 2 distinct services. Unfortunately, your accounting system does show distinction in those 2 efforts, and the costs broke down essentially 40% flood protection, maintaining the levees, and a 60% cost allocation to the stormwater collection through the canals and then pumping out through the various pump stations. So next page, please, Kevin. So to the top, there we go, flood protection. So the big picture here on flood protection is a very simple concept, and that is the total cost of the flood protection, i.e. the cost of the levees, is allocated to all property internal to the boundaries of the district, simply based on the acres protected. And the cost doesn't respect or care what the actual use or value of the property is that's being protected. It simply is protecting area. So the result of the calculations there, we came to about $46 per acre of land for the flood protection service. So then the second service, being stormwater, the succeeding page 10 towards the bottom is the summary there in the italics. There we go. So the total cost of stormwater service was allocated to property based upon the estimated amount of stormwater each parcel generates. And the way that's done is a certain amount of rainfall is anticipated or projected to seep into the groundwater eventually through the ground, and yet there's an amount of water that's going to be generated as storm flows. And the way that's done is a calculation of net impervious area. So the example would be if you had a 1 acre parcel that contained a half-acre hard surface, that half-acre hard surface would be classified as net impervious area, and that area would be assumed to be generating stormwater, or a proportionate amount of stormwater that the system would have to handle. So to sum that, the total cost for stormwater service divided by the impervious surface areas results in almost $340 of net impervious acre for stormwater. Now, there's some items happening behind the curtain here, or down a level, and if Kevin, if you can go up to
Greg, I got a question on this I don't want to cut you off, so finish this thought, but I have a question on this last point.
No, sure, please, go ahead.
So when you talk about the net impervious area and how it's assessed across the basin, are you assuming that all acreage is treated the same? And the reason I ask is, for example, in the city of Sacramento, there is a drainage fee that's based on area, right? So is that factored in for lands? I mean, how does that work? Is this additive? I mean,
right.
Is it double dipping for property owners in terms of what they get?
Hey, Nick, I want to jump in there, Greg, if I may, because I want to explain, Nick, the difference here. So those areas of the city that don't contribute to our stormwater system, right? For the two components, one being levee protection, this being stormwater services. There are certain areas within the city that completely handle their own stormwater services, right? They have their own pumping plants, collection system, and discharge either to the NIMDEC or to the Sacramento River. Those areas in particular would not be charged this stormwater services fee portion, but they still would be charged the levy portion for the flood protection portion. So they're not double dipped, so to speak, because they're handling all of their stormwater independent from the district. There are other areas of the city that do have a stormwater fee that is collected, but the city places that stormwater collected from their system into our system, and then we provide additional service on top of that to pump that water out. So we're running our pumps because we're accepting the discharge from the city in those service fees. So it's an added benefit because the city doesn't carry that water completely away from those areas and discharge completely to the river. Those areas would have two charges for stormwater service. The city's charge for collection and their low lift stormwater pump system that then discharges into our storm system, and we have to pump again. So it's a two-step discharge process for those areas, and there's two different fees, one from the city and one from us.
Right, and I guess the fee for us, though, distinguishes between those areas that are in that situation you just articulated. Correct. Versus the ones that are completely, say, in the unincorporated area that okay. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, to the extent that the city has done a good job on identifying those areas that they're not collecting a fee from, that's on the city's charge, right? To make sure that they're not charging for a service that they're not providing. We don't have control over that, but we have distinguished those areas in our land classifications and use to have those different classifications, and it's all based on the county's assessment report and land use reports, and that the different customer classifications that are shown here in the ISC.
Okay, thanks.
Kevin, this is Chris. I had a question. Greg, thank you. You didn't have this in the original report, the ISC information. So I appreciate you putting that into the report now, but it only raises several questions. I'm curious where the numbers don't seem to match what's on the OEHA's website. Like they have light industrial and heavy industrial. I'm assuming this is a average number. Public utilities on the OEHA website is a lower number at 0.37. So I want to make sure I'm understanding and looking at the right report. So I'm just like airport. They didn't even have an airport number. So I'm just, can we get a link to the actual report that you're pulling these numbers from now that it's actually in this report to be able to tell whether what property we're charging the ISC numbers for?
Right, and thank you, Trustee Burns. Yes, we'll put a link in there for you, and as it relates to the OEHA report, they don't have each and every classification that I have here. It doesn't contain all those uses. So we've done work as it relates to county land uses that the OEHA report does not consider. So for example, the airport, we've done the most recent stormwater study that went out for 218 public hearing notice this week. So just completed that study for the city of Sacramento, which is very convenient because same county, a lot of the same data. We were able to capture a lot of the analysis we did in and for the city of Sacramento and apply it to you. So we actually.
So the ISC numbers that you're using here in this table are consistent with the same coefficients or factors that are used for the city's stormwater. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So all I'm asking then is that we actually put that source where people can, you know, because if we're going to start charging people, they ought to be able to see where we're pulling these numbers from, because if you go to the link and that you point to, they're not there. So I just want to make sure that legally defensible, we can say we're using, you know, these numbers from this website, et cetera, to be able to justify the fee.
Yeah, I do want to point out during the Finance Committee, this was one of the areas that the Finance Committee pointed out to MBS to include this table. And so we got this back and included it. And yeah, we will definitely have MBS reference the source for that. I do think it is important for the district to be consistent with what the city's methodology is, so that our customers that are receiving two stormwater fees essentially from the city and from us, that the coefficients are consistent. So as long as we reference that source, I think we're in good shape.
Well, and thank you. That actually brings up another point, and maybe Nick can help on this one. Speaking of consistency, I believe our developer fees are based on developments and their ISCs or something, they're impervious. And so are we going to make sure that this fee is consistent with what we're charging developers? And if we're not, are we going to be in a potential legal issue because we're charging the developers one way in calculating that fee, and we're going to calculate this one differently?
Yeah, Chris, so I think as we move forward with this and we adopt these, if we adopt these ISC figures and these coefficients in this fee, we would probably need to initiate an update of our development impact fee, which is from 2015. So yes, now that we have new information and new methodology, we would certainly want to make sure that we're consistent internally on how we're allocating fees, and we would need to update the development impact fee and probably have LWA do that. If this is approved and adopted, that we have a new fee, we kind of put a hold on any development fees until we update that so that we're consistent.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Trustee Burns. And the only thing I would point out is that this report is not intended to be a full rate study with all the data, footnotes, 218 legal justification language. This is intended to give the board an understanding of the general concepts and principles and a preliminary modeling of the rates. So not intended to be a legal document.
Right, and that points to the kind of separation of phase 2, which was phase 2.1 is to look at the different funding mechanisms. In phase 2.2, we'll further refine all of the proposed rates and come back with a comprehensive report for phase 2 that's legally defensible, essentially what's called the engineer's report, that we would go out if approved by the board in November of next year as the approved engineer's report, legally defensible, justified, and consistent through all of our applications. So the point today is really to determine that fee is the recommendation to move forward with, as opposed to a special assessment or a tax. And then these numbers will be further refined as we get into the detailed work at phase 2.2. For illustrative purposes, we felt it was appropriate to include some preliminary results based on all the work we've done to date to kind of determine the magnitude of the impact to the community.
And I also want to say thank you, Greg, for providing the information on attachment B. That was very, very helpful this time around too.
You're more than welcome. And just maybe just as a local data point, again, relative to the city of Sacramento, and the 218 notices that went out this week, their polling was very favorable for the stormwater services. That does not mean that it directly applies to the district's efforts. There was a good deal of polling and research and consulting that went into arriving at the final numbers. But my general point is, and as has been recognized by Kevin today, there's a big storm coming in, and people are interested in protecting their properties. So it's a timely issue. So thank you for that. To get back to the report, I think probably page 13 is the best place to go. Yeah, you're already there, Kevin. Thank you. Yeah, total average cost per parcel. Is that 13?
No, that's 11. That's 11.
Yeah.
So I'll get to 13.
Yeah, we don't need to dissect the rates for each service and how it all come out. We'll just get to it. So the final column here, total average cost per parcel. This is what you're looking at for your average property owners again, and this is again, these are averages because you've got two different components. One component based on gross area per property and another component based on net area that's been adjusted by the ISC. So not all players are the same. So there's some averages there.
Can I ask you, Greg, on this? So certainly kind of in terms of orders of magnitude for single family, you kind of get that. I guess when it comes to other classifications of property, there's obviously varying ranges of acreage on a parcel. So that probably is a little misleading. I'd say, you know, for example, a cost per parcel for agriculture at $3,800, you know, that seems like a lot, but certainly that's some based on some average acreage assumption. So just so folks in the public are aware that those details will be fleshed out in the next step, I think, as it relates to a particular property. So this is just intended to provide some kind of range here and some kind of,
Right. And earlier in the report, there is the number for gross and net area. So based on the information provided in the report, you could calculate the charge for any given property characteristics. So if you had a 1 acre agricultural parcel, you know what the dollars per acre for flood protection is. Boom, you can calculate that. If you have a 1 acre agricultural parcel, you know what the net impervious or what the impervious surface coefficient is. So you can come up to the net area and hit that by the net area factor, and you know what the calculation is. The intent of this table is, again, just to provide an average in each of these customer classes. So I think
Greg, where's that information on if, you know, to sort of back into a particular property, you know?
Right. So those were in section 331 for flood protection on page 9. So it gave you the value of $45.76 per acre for flood protection. Right there. So that's for each and every property.
And then the second portion would be on the customer class here for the total stormwater services portion. And I can tell you, Nick, that this was a question that was brought up in phase 2 in the finance committee, and we will have essentially in phase 2.2 the ability to look up per APN if this methodology is approved. You know, we haven't spent time moving into phase 2.2, but we will develop that. So essentially every APN in the district from the assessment role will be able to plug these figures into that spreadsheet and look it up to see the exact impact per parcel as proposed.
Okay, thank you.
In the interim, you could use to back into those two portions of the proposed fee, which would be the stormwater component and the flood protection component. Based on the, your ISC number is shown in this table.
Right, and there's a few little subtleties as it relates to creating a customer class for the residential uses that is super boring, and I don't know if the board wants to endure that. So
I think we'll pass on that today, Greg, because
my excitement level is peaking right now. So, but yeah, if anyone wants to, further discuss the creation of customer classes and how those numbers are arrived at, we're more than happy to do that. This is probably not the appropriate venue. And then,
so at this point, Greg, I think the foundation's been laid here for the decision for today. Fee versus assessment or tax. MBS's work for phase 2.1 was to make a recommendation. That recommendation is to move forward with further investigation of a fee and go into phase 2.2, where we'll further develop and refine those ISC numbers, make sure we're consistent with the city or whatever source that we want to use. Make sure then that we, if successful in this process, we know there's some future work to do on our development impact fee. There was the recommendation from the Finance Committee that we discussed a little bit more in detail than we have today with the board, but there was a unanimous recommendation to approve phase 2.1 with some of the changes that we discussed, the inclusion of the ISC table, and then also the California Cities report, which was referenced during the Finance Committee meeting as Appendix B. So that's been included in the report that staff's put forward to you today. So this time I'd like to open it up to the board for discussion or recommendation and then public comment. And then hopefully, if there's any questions in detail, we can go into that. But there is more work to be done in phase 2.2. And I think a lot of the questions on that level of detail will be answered when we get to that point, probably in the next 2 to 3 months, I think is our timeline.
I certainly want to hear. Oh, go ahead, Jag.
Thanks, Nick. So Kevin, I have a question for you. I know when we originally looked at our capital improvement plan and condition assessment, we had some projects lined up for fairly early based on the needs. So one of the questions I have is now, because we're moving into a fee-based type of structure, we are looking at getting a set amount every year, which means some of those projects' timeline could or will potentially be pushed back. The question I have is, I personally want to make sure that the projects that are critical and need to be, started sooner than later, how will this impact it going to restricted revenue in first few years?
Yeah, Jag, that's a great question. And the thought here is that, and especially given the auditor's report, we have, give or take, $10 million in reserves now. Some of that's locked up for obviously flood fight and O&M reserve. The rest is for capital. So the thought specifically, the most critical item that we need to move forward with is pumping plant 8 in staff's opinion and based on the CIP and actually recent performance. The pumping plant 8 project is about $25 million in total. And so we think, and that's why we're working with KSN right now to look at sequencing and phasing of that project so that we can do it in kind of affordable chunks. And the means here is that, if we can get through the stuff that's like critically failure points now and get set up for when we receive the funding, so to then enact that next step to move forward, we think we can reduce significant risk in doing that. The advantage of doing pay-as-you-go is that you have some flexibility and adaptability in your CIP plan, as opposed to doing some bond financing. So if we went out and generated, a bond financing measure and got, a huge influx of cash to fund all the critical projects in the first 5 years, right? We would this new revenue stream would need to be in place. And the first check that we cut every year after we get this new revenue stream is for debt servicing. And so the problem therein lies is that if you do get into a flood fight and deplete your operating reserve and your flood fight reserve, your operating reserve, and your capital reserve to do that flood fight, you have no mechanism with this new funding instrument to refill the coffers for the flood fight reserve and the operations reserve, because your new revenue stream is only dedicated to capital improvement projects. And you have a timeline to complete those projects and make assurances to the bondholders that you're making that debt service obligation for those payments. So providing this method of kind of, there may be some years that we do very little capital improvement work as we're saving in our capital reserve fund over successive years to fund a larger project. What it allows us to do, though, is if we do have in the interim a failure at a pumping plant that we thought was going to be pushed off 10 years from now, we can then reallocate our capital funds to address that issue moving forward. The hope is that within 10 years, we've funded every capital improvement we need to do and reset the timeline that we then go on scheduled routine replacement based on useful life as opposed to run to failure. But we also maintain our flexibility to determine our own path every year in our budget, given the available revenues we have, given the condition of facilities, and still significantly reduce the risk that we have today.
So, I mean, just in case if there is a critical need that arises in year 2 or 3 and we don't have enough revenue at that point, what other options we have to go after to do that work?
Yeah, we could always go secure bond financing or loan. I mean, you can get a low interest loan from various programs where the state or the bank, get a line of credit. You would have to then dedicate your new revenue stream for that repayment of that loan. But there are sources for emergency funds that we can go after if we determine, we don't have the funding reserves to complete this. It makes the most sense to do this now. We would make that conscious decision and then dedicate a portion of these new revenues to completing that specific project. But it doesn't lock us in for the entire program, and it's not the first cut of new revenue stream that then puts at risk our other reserve funds and other critical needs.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you.
And then also too, Jack, I do want to point out that this does leave us the option every year in this fee, the way we would do it. Every year we have to justify the fee that we're putting in place and identify that we still have an ongoing need. So that after 10 years, if we determine, construction costs went down, we found really creative ways and we've reduced costs operation-wise and we don't need that fee, we don't have to go up to the maximum every year. In fact, we can't, because we have to justify the need for it. So I'm thinking, and you can see from Greg's chart earlier in the report, that after about year 10, 12, that kind of need drops off and you saw that revenue stream continue going forward. That's a good time that we could slow down and reassess and reevaluate our CIP and our needs moving forward. And I do want to point out that we will be aggressively seeking grant funds that can augment this fee, but shouldn't be relied upon as a base because they're not guaranteed and not insured to occur.
So to touch on something you just mentioned, Kevin, about flood fight reserves, what can you repeat what you just said?
Yeah, I'll repeat it kind of very, very simply. If we went out for bond financing, this new revenue stream, we would have to obligate to secure that bond financing to the bondholders an annual debt obligation payment, which means that they get their money first before anything else is paid for the district. Those bondholders, to get the best rating and the best rate, will want to ensure that we have the capability to provide that. In addition to that, we have to keep a debt service reserve. So we'd have to create a reserve that's oftentimes 1.5 times the annual debt obligation in a separate account. So what happens if, in our current environment, the flood fight reserve is our primary reserve account. all other reserve accounts, if the flood fight reserve gets depleted, we move funds from the operating reserve and the capital improvement reserve to replenish the coffers of the flood fight reserve. If we were in debt financing, if we debt finance for our additional revenue need, none of those funds could go into the flood fight reserve to replenish the flood fight reserve because they're dedicated to the capital improvement projects and a debt service payment. So if we deplete our flood fight reserve and replace our existing assessment, we would have no mechanism to replenish our flood fight reserve aside from a new initiative.
Got it. All right, thanks for that.
So the goal here, Nick, is to create the most flexibility moving forward, but also generate enough revenue stream for capital replacement, flood fight reserve, operating reserve, and to move forward to, and then have the ability to move funds between those reserve accounts depending on what happens in the future.
All right, thank you. I would just say, and I want to obviously hear if there's anyone here from the public to comment on this, but I'm certainly very supportive of going to the next step. It's very clear, in my opinion, that we have capital needs. We are underfunded, and I think we need to allow, the folks that will be paying this fee to consider voting for it. And so I'm very much in favor of going the next step, but certainly want to hear what other board members have to say, and certainly if there's anybody from the public. But I'm ready to move forward with this next step.
Thank you, Nick.
Kevin?
Mr. Brandis, go ahead.
And maybe this may having a senior moment, but is the new fee, it replaces the current assessment?
Yeah, essentially, we made that determination early on, is that any funding mechanism that we want to move forward with would replace the existing assessment, especially because it's a different methodology used. The current assessment's based on a zone of benefit methodology that, quite frankly, is past its useful life as well, like much of our infrastructure. It was the preferred method about 35, 40 years ago. We know a lot more now about how these services and fees are calculated, and the legal environment has changed as well, that the current basis for the assessment and fee, although it's supported and can continue moving forward if this process is unsuccessful, and it's valid under law, but we think this is a more fair and equitable distribution of the cost for the district and using the most prevalent methodology available to us today. And it would replace the existing fee, so that drops off.
And the
or assessment, rather.
The current assessment, it's not tied to our bylaws in any way. I mean, do we have to amend the bylaws to implement this new fee?
Yeah, Rebecca, if you would join in here. I don't believe so, Tom. I know that there are some references in the water code to assessment and how we have assessment seats and parcel seats. We may need to do some work if we go to a fee as opposed to an assessment to have that legislation changed to reflect the fee as opposed to assessment, but I think the basis is still the same. But Rebecca, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's correct, Kevin. So the basis is still the same. You're not looking right now at a modification of your bylaws, or frankly, even right now, a modification of your legislative or of the special act related to RD 1000. We will continue to work with NBS as they move forward in designing the assessment and fee, or sorry, assigning the fee, to make sure that we appropriately track that. And there may at some point be necessary a legislative change in order to reflect the fact that this is a different model.
Yeah, a different term as far as fee versus assessment.
Yeah.
So but it shouldn't impact the ability to enact the fee or how trustees are elected, because there is one portion about the assessment, but it can be reasonably determined that the number of votes received is essentially based on how much you pay for that certain election. And so those votes will be calculated based on the levy protection and the stormwater component would be the total paid to the district, which entitles the total number of votes in any given election.
One last question. Are there examples of other reclamation districts that have changed to this form of fee?
Greg?
Gotta find the mic button. Yeah, since the passage of Prop 218 in '96, the use of assessments has become quite difficult. And so not just restricted to reclamation districts, but all public agencies, water conservation districts, cities, flood protection, everyone's moving away from the special assessments due to the complications and subsequent court decisions relative to findings of general and special benefit. It's really fallen out of favor over the last several years. I'd say about the last decade, it's become more rarely used. So
the answer, Tom, is yes.
Yeah, sorry. I love this work.
Yeah. Greg's very passionate about this. But yeah, the answer, Tom, is yes. Special assessments are definitely out of favor. And as reclamation districts are updating, and especially us being kind of on that cutting edge, especially with residential and industrial development in our district, we're out there in front using the latest methodology and justifications for this. So absolutely yes, public agencies are migrating towards this fee as opposed to special assessment.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the board for Greg or myself? Any members from the public that would like to comment? Hearing none, I'd entertain a motion based on the Finance Committee's recommendation to approve phase 2.1 and authorize the general manager to work with MBS to develop phase 2.2 and return to the board with a final recommendation.
So moved.
Okay.
All right, so just for clarity, because I didn't recognize the voice, I think it was Trustee Gilbert that moved, and the second was?
Brandis.
Brandis. So motion by Trustee Gilbert, second by Trustee Brandis. Jolene, will you take the roll?
Yes, Trustee Gilbert.
Aye.
Gilbert, aye. Lee Reader.
Aye.
Reader, aye. Abdus.
Aye.
Abdus, aye. Baines.
Aye.
Baines, aye. Barandis.
Brandis, aye.
Barandis, aye. Burns.
Aye.
Burns, aye. Jones.
Aye.
Jones, aye. Motion is approved.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Greg. It's been a lot of work, and I appreciate your efforts getting us to this point. And I'll be in touch early next week on phase 2.2 and get together a timeline so we can return to the board. So thank you so much and have a great weekend.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.
All right, on to item 6.3. Courtney, are you with us?
I am.
Hi, Courtney. Thank you for being patient.
Hey, Kevin, may I interrupt here? I'm sorry not to interrupt the flow here, but I have a prior commitment at 10, and I'm concerned. I'm really interested in 6.4. That's not to diminish what Courtney has to say, but I would respectfully request looking at item 6.4, if you don't mind. I'm sorry, Courtney, if you don't mind just holding on just a little bit longer.
No objections from me.
All right, Courtney, thank you for being patient. If okay with the board, we'll go to 6.3 and come back to, or 6.4 and come back to 6.3. 6.4 will only take maybe about 10 minutes, Courtney, I think, to discuss, and then we'll be right back with you. So item 6.4, thank you, Nick, because I want to make sure that you're included in this discussion. the staff report here, we have kind of a conflict going on, not a conflict, but a situation going on with levee recertification for the Natomas Basin. As you all know, the district, SAFCA, the Corps, the state, everyone involved in the Natomas Levee Improvement Project has been working towards FEMA recertification in about 2025, right? Depending on how the Corps projects and funding go. And the thought here is, and what's been told to the community for years has been, we need to get back to 100-year flood protection, 200-year flood protection. The promise has kind of been, that after that, flood insurance, if successful in that recertification, will kind of go by the wayside. The moratorium on building has been lifted, but potentially could be at forfeiture if we don't submit that letter of map revision to FEMA and it gets approved in 2025 timeframe. So one of the portions of that work, SAFCA has been working on the exterior levee stuff and working with MBK and Rick Reinhardt. Partly why we're doing, not partly why, but why we're doing our SWIFT implementation to remove the encroachments is to be able to get recertified on our exterior levee. The second component is interior levee recertification that the city of Sacramento, as the floodplain manager, is responsible to do. And so they've retained KSN a number of years ago. They had some significant difficulties in updating their hydraulic model. Hence, RD1000 stepped in, led that effort to acquire the updated hydraulic model, and we're working through that right now. KSN's identified some significant deficiencies in the geotechnical data available to recertify the interior levee system. And they identified about $1 million worth of work that's needed to get that geotechnical data to continue on concurrent path for recertification to FEMA. The city, unfortunately, doesn't have a funding mechanism in place today to fund the $1 million worth of geotechnical borings that need to be initiated by June of 2022. So if those borings aren't done, there's significant potential that our timeline and the billions of dollars that's been spent on the exterior levee, the millions of dollars that have spent on the interior levee and hydraulic model update could be significantly impacted by the inability to get these geotechnical borings. In order to continue to move this forward, RD1000 can take a leadership position here and make $1 million available to initiate the work for the geotechnical borings to occur by June of 2022, and to keep us on pace, provided that we could enter into a reimbursement agreement with the city with a payback term over probably 3 years to pay back the funds that we've put out. We do have the reserve funds available to do this work. We do have at least a statement from staff that the reimbursement agreement could work, because when they allocate budget every year, they look at all their existing agreements, kind of like a bond payment that we don't want to get into for our CIP work, but they have obligations for current agreements that take priority in their annual budgets. So we could lock them into annual payments over the course of 2 to 3 years to repay that $1 million. We do have $600,000 in our existing budget for capital improvement work for engineering. So essentially what I'd be asking for is a $400,000 budget amendment out of the CIP reserve into this fiscal year to fund the $1 million with the city, provided that I enter into a reimbursement agreement with the city on favorable terms. One of those deal points would be that we would add interest either at the city pool rate or the LAIF rate, because we would be earning that interest income if it sat in our reserve funds before we used it. It's only fair and applicable to use an interest rate similar to what our expected return would have been. So if the board's favorable to that, I would work with Rebecca to negotiate that reimbursement agreement with a budget amendment today of $400,000 into our capital improvement plan for the year, with coming out of capital reserves.
All right, or Chris, go ahead.
I just was gonna, so we do have the $1 million, we have that from, what is it, KB, or NBN, not MBS. We have that $1 million invoice somewhere that says it's $1 million, because I'm thinking with inflation and cost of stuff going up, is $1 million gonna be enough?
Yeah, from KSN, I talked to Barry. He's obviously, he was the lead for our capital improvement project. I have a really good relationship with Barry. He told me that, and he helped me write the staff report today. He estimates it's $1 million of geotech work. I do need to caution the board, depending on the results of the geotech investigation, there could be the potential that there's levee improvements that are needed after that's done to still get to. So this is one hurdle. There could be the potential for the hurdle for the city to need to do improvements to those channels in the future. So they may come back to us for another reimbursement agreement because they haven't contemplated any of this work in their current 218 process they're going for. But as long as we can lock them into a reimbursement agreement, I think that we continue to provide the leadership for the basin and continue to meet the promises that have been made to the basin and our community. So $1 million is what Barry told is what needed, and we would not exceed that amount, Chris, in no means.
Well, no, I just want to make sure that we're going to authorize enough, because this is critical work to do no matter what. We're going to find issues whether we do it or the city does it. So I just want to make sure we're going to allocate enough to make sure it's done.
Yeah, and Chris, you know, I might have a better understanding of that as we move into the budget for fiscal year 2022, 2023. If KSN says they need some more, the initial ask would be with the city for a reimbursement agreement for this work on this scope. And then if there's more work that's needed, we would talk with KSN and possibly allocate more money in the 2022, 2023 budget with a second reimbursement agreement for the geotech work if necessary. So there's a mechanism to do that.
Thank you. I'm ready to move it, but I'll defer to Nick. Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, no, thanks. I'll second it. I think this is critically important and again underscores the leadership position that Party 1000 continues to take on issues in the basin. I will say it was a little frustrating that this work isn't included in the 218 process right now that the city's undergoing. But again, they must have their reasons for not advancing this as quickly as I think it should be advanced. And maybe it's just me wanting to see things get done like yesterday. But Chris is right. This is critically important and 100% behind this effort. And I would say, Kevin, continue to push to get this work done in a timely manner and get these results so we can, file that map of that letter of map revisions so folks can be relieved of this flood insurance burden, at least have the choice to continue to participate and at lower rates, hopefully. So anyway, yeah. So with that, I'll second Chris's motion.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yes.
Is the entire $1 million would be reimbursed by the city? There's no portion that's our responsibility?
Yeah, the intent of the negotiation and reimbursement agreement that Rebecca and I would work on with the city would be ensure that we receive the full $1 million back. We may, if improvements are necessary down the road, we'll again negotiate with them on what portion, because some of them may be for RD 1000 facilities. If there's a cost share for that, if we need to advance it even further to that next hurdle I described. But yes, the intent would be the full $1 million reimbursement for these geotechnical investigations. And when I say they don't have it included in their current 218, while it's not identified, they put their requests in every year, at least from my understanding, for budget, which they could, essentially ask for, but there's no guarantee of. If there's a reimbursement agreement in place, it's a guaranteed replacement and it's funded. So this actually helps them for this portion of their work.
Thank you.
All right, so we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none,
Ready to
Jillian, will you
vote.
take? Yeah, so the motion is to make a budget amendment of $400,000 and direct the general manager, so to include out of reserves, $400,000 into our current CIP, and then for the general manager and district council to negotiate and execute a reimbursement agreement with the city of Sacramento. All right, Jillian, will you take roll?
I will. Trustee Gilbert.
Aye.
Gilbert, I. Lee Reader.
Aye.
Lee Reader, I. Abdus.
Aye.
Abdus, I. Baines.
Aye.
Baines, I. Barandis.
Brandis, aye.
Barandis, I. Burns.
Aye.
Burns, I. Jones.
Aye.
Jones, I. Motion is approved.
All right, thank
Kevin,
you.
I just want to say, because I'm going to drop off here in a few minutes, I just want to acknowledge the work you're putting in, to get ahead of these issues, the floodplain model update and this issue. It was because of your diligence and leadership, and frankly, environmental awareness of what's out there that we are even in a position to consider this. So I just want to thank you for being on top of it.
Yeah, Nick, no problem. We just got to keep that. It's important for the community, so I appreciate that. And yeah, we'll keep on top of it for sure. Nick, I do want to follow up with you if you have a chance this afternoon on item 6.3 with the item here, because there will be, if approved, some impact to the development community, which I know you work closely with. So I will follow up with you if you have time. Give me a call this afternoon.
Okay, sounds good. I'll stay on as long as I can here, but yeah, thanks.
All right, Nick, thank you. All right, Courtney. Thank you for being patient. So item 6.3 is the district's cost allocation plan. In our budget this year, we included in the, it was, which committee did it? The Finance Committee reviewed the RFQs for Matrix to come on to do a cost allocation plan. Essentially, what the cost allocation plan does is allows the district to collect administrative costs that are spent on projects that are done for others that aren't to the benefit of the entire basin, but based on work derived into the sole benefit of others. The other thing that it does for us is allows us to apply an administrative rate to any grants that we secure, whether they're state or federal, and be able to recapture some of the costs for administrative work as opposed to just filling out hourly rates. So Courtney, I'll turn it over to you, and I have your presentation from the Finance Committee. If you want me to pull that up, that might be.
Sure, that'd be great.
Okay. Here we go. Let me see if I can go full screen. All right.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all. I appreciate the opportunity this morning to give this presentation to those who are not part of the Finance Committee. And again, to those who were part of the Finance Committee. But so what I wanted to do today was give you an overview of the indirect cost allocation plan and the results that we did. Kind of talk a little bit about why we would do this plan, the steps that we went through to conduct it, and then kind of the results, the outcomes of that. So if you'll go to the next slide for me, Kevin. So really the scope was to develop a cost allocation plan and indirect rates. And the reason that we want to do this is so that we can identify, document, and allocate indirect costs associated with the district administration and operations. And we want to do this fairly and equitably. We don't want to just kind of take any old cost that we can and call it overhead and say people should bear the burden of that. What we want to do is kind of say what is allowable, what's not allowable, and what's fair to be included as overhead. Identify that and document that. The reasons that you do a cost allocation plan would be one, to kind of give that detailed picture. You know, what are your indirect costs? What is that administrative cost, and how does it support district staff and district programs? It creates defensible overhead and indirect rates, not just for the everyday projects that you're doing now, but any grant related projects moving forward. It helps justify those grant reimbursement requests that you could be applying for. Next slide, please. So two key components that we have to keep in mind when we're doing cost allocation and indirect costs One, we want to ensure compliance with OMB guidelines. That's the big one. And secondarily, we also want to make sure that we're aligning with GFOA best practices. So we want to make sure that we're doing things, appropriately from an accounting perspective. So the OMB guidelines say that costs should be reasonable and they have to be in alignment with the services that are being provided. We can't, again, arbitrarily or intentionally inflate or deflate costs in order to account for certain things. We need to make sure that those costs are necessary to the purpose of the service that's being provided. We can't take, we're at the holidays now, we can't take costs associated with holiday parties or Christmas cards and allocate those out as overhead. We really have to kind of scrutinize the costs that we have and say this is allowable or this is not allowable. And then we need to use metrics to allocate those costs that relate to those services. So really are reflecting how those services are being provided and the significance of those services. And then as far as GFOA is concerned, they really want you to calculate the full cost of providing indirect services in order to set those rates. Again, that we don't just choose rates and say this seems to be right or this is what everybody else is doing, so we're going to apply that for ourselves. And adopt formal policies regarding cost recovery. Once you understand what those costs are, you don't have to go for full cost recovery. You can always choose something less, or you can make policies to affect certain situations, but just to document those decisions and why we made those decisions so that they don't just carry forward year after year after year, especially if circumstances change. And then finally, to kind of do something like this at a minimum every 3 to 5 years with an outside perspective. You can always do it more often than that, but at a minimum, just to kind of, as things change, staff changes, technologies change, just to make sure that you're still in alignment with where you need to be. So overall, the project steps that we took in working with the district was we started with classifying employees as either direct or indirect. So direct staff are those that account where their time is associated with monitoring and maintaining district levees, canals, and pump stations. So those are essentially the people who are out in the field, who are doing the work, so to speak, that the public really sees. The indirect staff are those who are responsible for district operations, reception, records management, human resources, fiscal oversight, the behind the scenes staff that not everybody gets to see, but I'm sure that all of you know very well. And then once we looked at staff and kind of classified that as direct and indirect, we also looked at expenditures from the same perspective. But we also looked at it in the terms of whether it was direct, indirect, or unallowable. And so unallowable expenses are things like legal services, election costs, homeless expenses, bad debt. Again, those things that shouldn't necessarily be burdened as overhead to particular projects. And then once we had all that information, we developed fixed indirect rates that can be used both for general projects as well as federal or grant related projects. Next slide. So real quickly, what the district is doing currently, so it uses hourly rates to bill for the services that staff provide. However, these rates don't account for indirect support. They're really just in relation to the salaries and benefits associated with that employee. Now, the rates are done by classification, so it's not just a single blended rate, but they are only really accounting for salaries and benefits of those staff. The district doesn't have separate rates. So if it were to, even though it doesn't currently have federally funded projects that require a grant rate, it doesn't have separate rates. So if that were to take place, it would need to address that because the grant rates would require that you use much less overhead. Next slide. So some recommended modifications through this study are that the district should establish 2 different types of rates. The first one, full cost rate, that you can apply to the majority of the work that you're doing right now. They can be annually updated based on salary and benefit increases, and you could do a study every 3 to 5 years just to kind of make sure that you're in alignment on that. And the second rate would be the Omb Compliant Rate, and this rate would be used when the district has projects that are limited, that limit the indirect cost recovery. So again, a state or a federal grant that's going to come in is going to have more restrictions on what you can include as overhead. And you want to make sure that when those projects come in, that you have the ability and you're set up with the rates to apply for those services. Those types of rates could potentially need to be recalculated annually, but it can also depend on the type of funding or the funding source of what you're getting. So some of those funding sources might say they'll accept that rate in year one, maybe it's a 3 or 5 year project, and say we'll accept those rates going forward. Others might require that you update that rate annually. So depending on what those requirements are, it could be anywhere between an annual or every 3 years kind of adjustment. Next slide. So we have the two types of rates of a full cost rate or an OMB rate, but there's also two most common ways in which you can develop a rate. One is when it's based on expenditures, and the other one is when it's based on salary and benefits. And so when we talk about an expenditure rate, we would use that rate and we would apply it to the entire project cost. That would be for projects that we are primarily managing, but for which we don't really have a lot of staff that are billing to. So even though we're not billing to it, we still are managing it, we're still overseeing it, so we still have indirect costs associated with that. Whereas there's a salary and benefits rate, which we would use for when we actually have staff that we can bill to that project. And so then that's based on the district's salary and benefits, and we would only apply that indirect cost rate to the staff hourly rates. So with that, we get to the rates. So for the full cost rate that was calculated, the expenditures rate would be 40.85%. So again, we would apply that to any private developer or consulting projects that are managed by the district, but for which we really don't have district staff that bill against it. But if we were going to have projects that are going to be where we're going to use district staff to provide services, the indirect rate would be the 92.48%. And so just to show you what that means on a positional basis, the base salary rates are in that second column there, and the fully burdened hourly rates, meaning it includes that 92.48%, are in the left-hand column. So again, when I talked a little bit earlier about making policies, we talk about that fully burdened rate, and I'll just talk about the operations supervisor of around $142. One of the things that the district should look at is do we increase our rates, which obviously there's indirect costs that you're not covering. So if you do increase your rates, do you want to go to 100% cost recovery? Do you go to that 142 or somewhere in between? And so that's something to consider as you look at these rates and what the impacts of that would be on developers and on projects.
Yeah, so Courtney, I want to jump in there. So staff's recommendation is to go to 100% cost recovery for this. We think it's fair to the rest of our ratepayers and constituents that we're doing work for others at their sole benefit. And so staff's recommendation is to go to that fully burdened rate. And just to give you some perspective, when Gabe or Tony goes out and does, and it's not just development work, it could be others as well, but when Gabe or Tony goes out to do an inspection on a relocation of a facility that's been done for a development project, currently we bill at only the hourly rate. So we're billing at, for Tony or whatever, operations supervisor, we bill $70 an hour only. Doesn't cover any of the administrative costs for me to set that contract up with the developer. For example, doesn't account for any of Christina's time to review the invoices, to process payroll, for Jolene to review payroll, for us to send invoices back to the developer, for us to set up contracts for the management team. So this really covers all of the costs associated with having Tony or Gabe out for that 1 hour of inspection. All of that's wrapped up into how Tony and Gabe were able to be out there to do that inspection and the cost to do that. So our recommendation is for the full 100%.
With that, I would just go to, I think, the last slide. Almost the last slide.
So yeah, Courtney, this is the OMB compliant rates. And so essentially what we'd be asking the board to approve today is 4 different rates, percentages wise. So we have our full cost allocation from the previous slide, and then the OMB compliant rates, which we would only use in limited times, essentially for federal grants, which don't allow for all of the recovery for certain projects. So the allowable administrative costs, the subset of that is significantly reduced, but we would use the full cost compliant rates most of the time unless we were in a situation on a federal grant that we had to have an OMB compliant rate. This was important to the Finance Committee at the approval of the contract with Matrix to develop those two rates so that we can be competitive and have them in place to apply to get as much funding back from the grants that we can and recover as much to the benefit of the district. So these rates are reduced from the full cost, and it's only because federal OMB grants don't allow other expenditures that are allowed in full cost. So yeah, questions?
Kevin, this
I
is Chris.
don't have any questions really, but this was a very thorough presentation, Courtney, and as a consultant myself, I fully understand the methodology. Unless my colleagues have other questions or concerns, I'm prepared to move the staff recommendation.
Yeah, Deborah, thank you. I do think that Chris was about to jump in there too. Chris, do you have a question?
Thank you. Well, no, I don't have a question because I think I moved this in the committee, and I would second Deborah's motion. I just I'm guessing or hoping that we're going to have some kind of fact sheet that we're going to send out to people who are currently
Yes.
either developers, so that way they're not surprised at this March 1st. All of a sudden they start getting charged more for stuff. So are we going to send some kind of notice out as soon as this is adopted?
Yeah, Chris, so I did want to give the current development community that we're under a development project impact fee agreement, however we term it. Those that are under current agreement, I would provide a notification to them, provide them the data and background on this, and I would send that out before the first of the year so that they have time to adjust for implementation. But we would start applying these rates and the markup, specifically like Mead and Hunt does most of the work. So our markup on those invoices, I think, Courtney, it was what, 40-something% that we would tack on to the consultants' invoices that come in. And that covers my time and Christina's time and Jolene's time. But we give them a time to adjust to the increased billing, or at least notification of it. And that's the intent on why we're not, starting it on Monday morning. So to give them time.
Appreciate that.
I think we have two under contract right now.
Okay, thank you. Then I second Deborah's motion.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So just real quickly, Kevin, so essentially you'd be sending out a rate sheet.
Yeah, I'd send out our new rate sheet for billable hours and I would send out that table, I think, from the resolution. Let me get to it here.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I just,
Yeah, with some explanation too, right? Here's our rates. And in fact, I just want to let you guys know that when I was contemplating this in the budget, in those development agreements, I did tell the developers that we're looking at this because I knew it was a deficiency in our current structure. And I warned them, now it's been almost 2 years now, that when we got into the agreement, our hourly rates would be changing and we'd provide them notification, and they were okay with that at the time. Now we'll see, what they come back with, but.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't have a problem with that. I mean, you can go ahead and give them some explanation, but typically I don't send out an explanation of how I derived my indirect costs rates.
Yeah, we'd certainly be able to provide them background, and so that's the point. Here's our new rate table or rate charts for work, and if you have questions, reach out to us.
Yeah, okay, perfect, thank you.
That's what we get from Mead and Hunt. Here's our new rates for next year, so.
Exactly.
Okay, so I have a motion and a second. I'm sorry, motion by Trustee Jones and second by Burns. Any public comment? I don't think anybody else. Okay, with that, Jolene, will you take roll on the motion to approve resolution 2021-1202?
Yes, Trustee Gilbert.
Aye.
Gilbert, aye. Lee Reader.
Aye.
Lee Reader, aye. Aptis, absent. Baines.
Aye.
Baines, aye. Barandis.
Brandis, aye.
Barandis, aye. Burns.
Burns, aye.
Burns, aye. Jones.
Aye.
Jones, aye. Motion's approved.
Thank you. Thank you, Courtney. I do want to point out to the board that one item particular onto this is that we will be updating this every year based on our actuals from the previous year. So my intent is this rate that was approved today will be effective essentially until July 1 of 2022. We should be able to have our actuals developed from this last audit from 2021. We'll update the model and then we'll propose new rates in the budget process like we proposed for the official pay rate schedule and the adoption of our budget. So we'll approve the new allocation rate in June with the budget approval. There'll be a couple items like approve the budget, approve the official pay rate schedule for the district, and then approve our cost allocation rates as well based on actuals from the year before. And that way it's fair and updated for the district every year. All right. Thank you all for, and Courtney, thank you. And we'll be in touch of any follow-up stuff and getting the model in our hands and next steps. So I appreciate it. And thanks for being patient this morning. Really been great to work with you. And Christina and Jolene, thanks for all the data information that was needed to get to this point. So it was a lot of work, but we got a good product and increased revenue potential for the district. So on to item 7.1.1. Any questions on the committee minutes? Hearing none, I see Chloe's joined the chat. Good morning, Chloe. So with that, nothing else is on the agenda, and I would take a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
I'll second that. I wanted to add before we vote on it that our next meeting is January 14th. And just
so I had initially I was mistaken at the executive committee meeting. I thought that our meeting was on the 7th, but that's not the case. We'll keep our meeting on January 14th as is, the second Friday of the month, and that should give us enough time to have all of our financials. The board packet may be delayed just a little bit as year end and closing the books and getting the financial reports out. But we'll still keep the 14th of January as our meeting date.
Okay, good.
Hi, Deborah.
Kevin, I understand the difficulty in putting together the board packets, having done so myself for many years. However, it really is helpful if board members have a weekend before the board meeting to review particularly really complex matters on the agenda. So if there's any way you can really push to get it out by January 7th, that would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, and so even if I have to send out a partial packet, the agenda for January doesn't look like anything like today's agenda. And in the future, moving forward, when we have big reports, before I can compile everything and get it formatted right, as soon as I get those documents, I may send it out to you in parts and pieces without the full staff report generated and explanation. But you could see like the MBS report or something. As soon as I get it, I can send it out and say, hey, the staff report and explanation is coming, but here's the background information. I can definitely do that ahead of time moving forward if that's the desire. I just don't want to inundate you with multiple versions and different things because that leads to confusion too. But
well, I don't know about the rest of the board, but I personally would prefer a complete packet 7 days in advance. That just makes life easier for me. I do have a life.
Yeah, I'd certainly appreciate that. And sometimes we're waiting on information that comes in last minute to make sure we have a complete packet. And we try to push, all the consultants are off the line, right? Except, well, everybody else's staff. But yeah, we try to push them as much as we can and make sure we have it all to then, it takes a few hours to put it all together in a complete packet. But yeah, we'll effort to have that out on on January 7th. We will need a quorum of the board in a special meeting for the executive committee meeting ahead of that to re-adopt our COVID-19 or AB 361 meeting. So I will send out a link, and if we could at least have 4 members to adopt a resolution at the executive committee meeting to continue to meet remotely, because there's 31 days in December and it pushes us out for the January board meeting. So I will send a link out for the executive committee meeting, which is going to be on the 5th, on January 5th. If we could have a quorum of the board, that would be fantastic. It'll take 2 minutes to approve that resolution and you guys can be on with your day. So, all right, well, thank you. We have a motion to adjourn by Trustee Burns, seconded by Trustee Jones, I believe. Jolene, will you take roll?
Trustee Gilbert.
Aye.
Aye. Lee Reader.
Aye.
Lee Reader, aye. Absent. Baines.
Aye.
Baines, aye. Barandis.
Brandis, aye.
Barandis, aye. Burns.
Aye.
Burns, aye. Jones.
Aye.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. Meeting's
Happy
adjourned.
holidays,
everyone. Merry Christmas, happy holidays, happy New Year, and we'll, if anything comes up, we'll talk before the new year, but hopefully not. Enjoy your holidays, and thank you so much for the lengthy meeting this morning. Really appreciate it. Have a great weekend.
See you. Bye-bye, everyone.